Hi everybody, thanks so much for joining us for what I think is the final session of the DevSummit. I really appreciate you spending your time with us today. So we're going to be talking about the future of education. My name is Richard Buttrey and I work in the ARM education team. And it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest today, who's Professor Rupert Wegerif of the University of Cambridge. So thanks again for joining us, Rupert.
Oh, hi Richard, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
And just tell us a little bit more about your background, if you could. You're a professor of education technology, I understand.
Sure, I did do a master's in computing once upon a time and a PhD in education technology back in the day at the Open University in England, where at that time everyone was working on AI. AI was the next big thing. I don't know what happened to that. It was back in the 90s. We were doing all this student modeling. But since then, I've been very involved in also teaching children to think, and I'm developing at Cambridge a kind of combination of the two, an exploration of how new digital technology could be used to transform education, to look at new models of education.
Fantastic. Well, I think you're, absolutely the right person to be kicking around this idea of the future of education. So thanks again. I'll just also mention that my colleague Robert Ianello is in the background, not on video, but on audio, and he's going to be helping us with the questions and comments in today's session. So we really encourage you to get involved. Whether you've got a point to make or you want to ask something of me or the speaker, then just type it away and Robert will interject. Don't know if you want to just say a quick hello, Robert.
Hi, everyone. Hi there.
Great. Thanks, Robert. Okay, so I mean, obviously the coronavirus situation is a real health emergency. It's a social problem too. But, there is that old adage that you should never waste a good crisis. And clearly there are kind of disruptive effects that are happening and accelerating the adoption of technology in a whole, suite of different areas. And one of the most, noticeable is education at the moment, particularly as undergraduates go back to university or don't, and begin to operate remotely. People are really asking this question, what should the educational system be like? What would it be fit for a 21st century version? So we really want to dig into that today and be slightly provocative, kick around some ideas. But before we do that, I thought it'd be useful, Rupert, just to hand over to you and get some sense of kind of where we come from. I know you've written recently about education system and said it's, fundamentally focused on print literacy. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Well, as I say, I started off in the field of education technology back in the 90s, and we had lots of exciting ideas, new possibilities for education, and it's interesting how they weren't adopted. And I've come to realize how coherent and resistant to change the global education system is at the moment. And it's actually not all that old. It's interesting when you look at it, it's about 100 years old, maybe 150 years old, depending on where you are. And it seems to me, just reflecting on it, that it's actually based on technology. So when people talk about education, they're confusing education with the needs of what is now a legacy technology, that is print literacy. They think school is about learning to read, to write, learning numeracy, which of course, I mean, is very reasonable. But if you think about it, there is education outside of that. There was education in oral societies, and education continues everywhere in a broader pattern as learning to be useful by participating in communities of practice, by apprenticeship and so on. So schooling is specifically focused on the needs of this technology of reading and writing, particularly print technology. Subjects are largely based on textbooks or the corpus that you have to read. When you study a subject at Cambridge, for instance, we don't say you're doing mathematics, we say you're reading mathematics. And then it's all examined by people sitting on their own, writing on bits of paper. And I think the very idea we have of truth and of knowledge is very influenced by the print medium. So we think of knowledge as a kind of representation, something you can store in a book, and maybe you can transfer it into a brain, and then you'll test if the brain has got it through whether they can write it down in an exam. And all of this seems to me linked to the technology of print. And now with new technologies, with the internet, with AI, with mobile phones, maybe we can think about education differently.
It's funny you mentioned, I mean, as you mentioned the print and the exam, I was getting a terrible flashback, from being an undergraduate in physics, and those terrible, few days where you have to suddenly kind of regurgitate everything that's been put inside of your head. And, the feeling of, whether you've missed a question in the paper is kind of terrifying. I mean, I understand at Cambridge this year, it wasn't possible to kind of operate that way. You had more of an open book approach. What happened?
Well, it is quite interesting because, as I say, back in the 90s, we had all these ideas for educational reform, but nothing could be changed, and nothing has been changed very much in England. But suddenly, with this crisis, everything changed overnight. I'm not quite sure why we have sit-down exams in the modern day and age, when in reality, any engineer or other professional has always got the internet with them, and they were always working in teams often. I was able to connect with people, but instead we have this exam situation. We have rooms full of students, it's very classic, sitting at their individual desk. It's part of my job description to turn up in a gown, and the gown is very important. Without the gown, I think the exam is invalidated, and this was repeated to me several times. It's absolutely insistent about it. So for this year, for the first year, I didn't have to turn up in a gown. It's quite early in the morning as well, usually, so I was very pleased about that. But also students, instead of having to sit there on their own, they could download the exam paper at the beginning of the week and upload it at the end of the week. And the result was, of course, the exam papers I got were much more readable. They're better written because they were typed, but also they were much better planned and they had much better evidence. And so hopefully, I think what we've mostly learned from this is that it is possible to change. In this case, the change seemed to be better. Of course, raises some other issues, which I'm sure are solvable, as to whether or not the students are actually writing their own papers, things of that kind. Obviously, there are lots of questions, but things couldn't be changed before because all those questions were raised by committees and they all said, oh, it's a bit risky, let's stick to what we've always done for the last 100 years.
Right.
I looked into it, hasn't been there for that long, Cambridge got the idea from China. There was a lot of pressure in the 18th century and early 19th century. They said, well, look, they've got these exams in China, why don't we have proper exams? So anyway, so it's not that old and it can be changed. And that's the extraordinary thing we've learned from this crisis, that everything can be changed and we could at least explore if it works better or not.
So in that case, the exams change. But I mean, what about the teaching and learning, where we're hearing about students returning, having to do mostly work online, even though they may be geographically sort of close to their professors. Give us an insight into what's happening at the moment and how effective you think it is.
Well, I guess the problem is that in a very short period of time, everyone has been asked to move their teaching and learning online. So there's been a lot of concern about that, a lot of discussions, a lot of advice going around. But mostly what's happening is that the existing schedule is just being put online. So say you had a 1 hour slot for a lecture, you do that lecture, we have a synchronous session with the students and people are maybe putting up PowerPoints and so on, but there isn't enough time or enough thought on how we have to change teaching and learning in this new situation. One example is indeed this having to stay at Cambridge. I'm getting requests through all the time from students who don't really want to move to Cambridge to sit on their own in a single room when everything's online, but the system is such that they're not allowed to do it at a distance. But that very fact raises all sorts of new ways of thinking about university education, doesn't it?
Right. So it sounds like you're saying we're in this sort of early stages of disruption where we're digitizing essentially the same kind of analog process we have before. But I think you're hinting that there's something much more profound that could be done or should be done. Well, I mean, what are these ideas? What could it be like?
Oh. Well, that's a very big and open question, and of course that's where the research comes in, because I don't really have all the answers. And of course it is always dangerous just to say things could be done differently, so therefore let's do them differently, because you will find whatever you try there will be different strengths and weaknesses. But the possibilities are enormous. We can see how these new technologies have enabled new forms of education to emerge in various areas. I'm particularly excited in computing education, for instance, by Scratch. I mean, I was, as I say, I was around at the dawn of the internet. Now people say it's old-fashioned, it's been around for ages, but it hasn't changed how formal education is done, and it could do. So, for instance, in Scratch, you're not just consuming computer code, you're generating it in a peer-to-peer learning community. I think that's one quite exciting example, which you see in many technical areas where people are learning from each other. And this seems to me a more, going back to a more natural form of education that you'd also find in oral societies, and it's possible everywhere. What's also exciting is the global reach, isn't it? So if we're saying, you know, people have to move to Cambridge to learn from Cambridge lecturers, of course, Cambridge lecturers are probably the best in the world, but they might not be. Why can't we get people teaching them from Harvard, from Stanford, or from Zimbabwe in the right topics? Why couldn't we have a more global network? There's so many things. I mean, let's think about these exams. What are we actually focusing on in these Cambridge sit-down exams? We're basically taking very diverse people with very diverse skills, and we're all locating them on a single scale. Are they a first-class person, a second-class person, maybe, heaven forfend, and never at Cambridge, a third-class person? What's the point of all that system? I mean, I can see it relates to a categorizing way of thinking that seems to me to be connected to print ways of thinking. But are they actually relevant in the modern age? Is there a chance to rethink what we're doing in education completely?
Yeah. So you were saying that, you know, this era has brought about some change, but it also sounds like there are some forces of resistance, you know, for instance, that wish to categorize people in the first or second division and so on. I mean, what are there kind of constraints and conforming factors that are getting in the way of us utilizing technology better for education?
Well, I guess so, because it does seem very resistant, and obviously it does serve certain interests. I was wondering, I mean, the extent to which what we see with the current education system is a kind of laundering of inequality. People are a bit embarrassed about their various differences and unequal backgrounds. And so they like to present it as, oh, look, I'm justified as being this top person because I've got a degree from Cambridge. If you actually scratch the degree in fine art or whatever it is, it might be totally irrelevant to what they're doing, but it's serving certain vested interests that are not necessarily in the interests of humanity going forward, facing all these global challenges. Our education system seems to be more about these print-based credentials that you can hang on the wall than it is about actually doing anything useful or being a useful person and solving real world problems and maybe creatively coming up with ways forward. So, you know, it does make you think about the whole thing, but clearly there are vested interests that are keeping us in the past. But of course, there's always massive inertia with any big system, and change is always difficult.
I mean, I was wondering, for the engineers, the software developers, the hardware engineers, technologists who are watching, you know, thinking back over their own educational history, you know, whether, you know, given the different opportunities, whether they would, you know, rethink the way they do it. And you're also making me wonder whether, you know, in part, large companies are also to blame for the status in that they, you know, they probably have expectations of new entrants in terms of degrees, whereas in fact they could be focusing, like you said, on the skills and knowledge and experience. I mean, how might we break the whole system so that new ways of education can flourish?
Well, I think the big companies do have a role here. It's all about how you're recruiting people. Are you recruiting them on what they can do or on the credentials that they can demonstrate? And of course, but many companies have led the way in demanding more real world skills, and also in trying to, I just saw, I think it was today actually, that IBM announced that they're going to train people in quantum computing. A lot of, and of course, Microsoft developed a famous Java core. So a lot of this push to transform education has come from the big internet companies. And of course, how they recruit people is rather important to this, whether they recruit them on the skills that they can demonstrate or on their credentials. At the moment, credentials are kind of essential to almost any job, and I've seen it move up rapidly in my lifetime. So jobs that used to be available to anybody so they could work their way up, and now you can't get in without a degree. So actually things have become more socially unequal than they were before.
What about parents, Rupert? I mean, I've got this general feeling that somehow parents kind of encourage their children into the sort of the thing that, you know, would have been the radical thing for the future, but now is overtaken. You know, so the old joke that, you know, son or daughter who's playing with computer games when they were younger was discouraged from that, and it turned out to be incredibly useful. And now, you know, we're perhaps encouraging our children into learning coding and maybe missing out on the thing that's coming down the line. What, you know, what is the proper role of parents here to try and? It's a big question, I realise.
Yeah, it's a big question. That just reminds me of, I had this lecture when I was doing the PGCE. It was some woman encouraging everybody to read and so on. And I couldn't resist going up and telling her, when I was a teenager, I used to spend my whole time in bed reading. I just get loads of mostly science fiction, Western, anything I could get my hands on. And frankly, it didn't do me any good. I didn't have a social life. I didn't do other stuff. It was really bad for me. So, and she couldn't even understand my question, because she'd been kind of trying to say, stop them playing video games, get them reading books. And I was thinking, why? You know, I mean, why is this tremendous prejudice we have in favor of anything old, you know, Shakespeare, books, against anything new, like the amazing creativity of things like Grand Theft Auto? Shouldn't we be encouraging people to be the film directors of the future, where we're talking 3D interactive movies? So as a parent, I mean, I basically taught my son, he's 20 now, but I spent a lot of the time with video games. But the important thing was not just to leave him to play video games, was to work with him to discuss them. We did a lot of time with Age of Mythologies and what was it, the strategy games with ancient civilizations. And now he's studying ancient history, absolutely loves it.
Right.
But through the video game. So say he needed to learn maths, we did shoot 'em up games with lots of maths. As a parent, I would encourage you to play video games with your children, but don't just let them get stuck on their own. The big problem, and where parents are always blaming things, like say, oh, it's the fault of video games or social media or drugs. The fault is the lack of parents. I'm afraid it's the lack of time. It's not their fault necessarily. It could be the way the society's forcing everybody to work all the time, but more time talking to your child, discussing, dialoguing, bringing out the meaning, and encouraging them in their passions and interests. I mean, there's a very general and broad advice where I might be going beyond my remit and invading the areas of my colleagues who do early years education, but I think that's probably good advice, isn't it? Does that make sense to you, Richard?
It does make sense. I shall go away and do that with my children this evening. So, I mean, one thing I'm wondering, Robert, perhaps you could tell us if anybody, I don't know if anybody in the chat is kind of raising this objection, but if they are, you know, let me know. But I was kind of voicing it perhaps on people's behalf, is that, you know, you're talking very positively about the possibilities of what technology can do, but you know, what about the people who don't have access to this technology for whatever reason? Are we not introducing huge kind of inequalities into the system here?
Well, that has appeared with this shift online. A lot of schools have gone online, and that's revealed that, of course, not all children have desks with computers and broadband access, and that's increased the inequality, I think. But that's the social push, isn't it? I mean, once upon a time in England and doubtless elsewhere, we suddenly realized that it's essential that everybody has flushing toilets and running water and electricity. And now as a society, everyone more or less does, unless you live in a very remote place in the mountains of Scotland. So it is possible collectively that we provide this access to broadband and to tablets and devices to use it for everybody. And I think that is an essential social good. So it's a political will that's needed. And it is.
But what about a more global view of that? I mean, you know, we're privileged here. You're right, maybe not everyone has an access to a computer, but the basic digital infrastructure is there. Whereas there are many, you know, nations and regions of the world where even that doesn't exist. I mean, is this not going to create a very significant digital divide in the world?
Well, I think it's roughly the opposite. But just to go back to the inequality thing, of course, inequality is much deeper than just access to the internet. Research has shown that some people know how to learn from the internet and others don't. And I think this does relate to the dialogue with parents that I was talking about. Some people are prepared to ask questions, to take agency, to socially network in order to pursue their interests, and others aren't. So it's really important that we do that kind of basic education into learning to learn. I call it dialogic education, how to engage in dialogue and learn from dialogues for everybody, as well as the broadband access. Sorry, but leaping to your other question, the reason why I don't think in the long run this will lead to greater inequality is because the print-based global education system is massively unequal. If you're lucky enough to be born in Finland, you're going to get really good quality education. If you're born in, say, Burkina Faso or Tanzania, less so. And the reason for that is that schools, textbooks, training teachers is very expensive. It's very difficult. So with the new technology, we have the possibility of leapfrogging that system, of moving directly to an internet-mediated global education network where you can learn from experts around the world. And you might say, well, that'll cut out all the social factors. Something that interests me and that I'd like to pursue is a development in Mexico from the Tec de Monterrey, where they have about 3,000 or 4,000 centros comunitarios de aprendizaje, where people often in poor regions can go, and as a community with a learning guide, they can use software on the computers that are provided. So maybe we could rethink schools as learning centers like that, where individuals can join communities online. So they might be with a social community physically, but also have a virtual community interested, for example, in Lady Gaga or growing cocoa beans or whatever their interest is to pursue that. So we ought to explore these possible future models, but I think they should overcome that inequality. I noticed that mobile phones now have 80% penetration in sub-Saharan Africa. So this technology is moving very rapidly.
So Richard, if I can quickly interject and just encourage everyone who's listening to the conversation to please participate in the chat if you've got any questions or comments. I know there was one comment, Rupert, basically totally agreeing with your view on parenting and the use of digital media to educate. So, but I would just like to encourage everyone to just contribute to the conversation by sharing their thoughts in the chat.
Oh yeah, I'm disappointed that I haven't been sufficiently provocative to
well, maybe Rupert, if we could just pick up on the point, about engineers and technologists who'd be listening and watching today. I mean, it feels like of all the kind of career paths that could take advantage of what the changes that you're talking about in education, it should be those domains. I mean, is there not an argument that if, let's say, you were a software developer now, there's really what's the point of university? I mean, we don't need it, do we?
Well, I mean, that would do me out of a job and my colleagues as well. But
we don't want to be that radical.
No, I'm sure you're right. I was impressed. Within the computing field, I did do some programming, and I know people in that area, how that transformed really rapidly once you had the internet, once you had forums where people could go and ask questions and learn from each other. So instead of having to like read the manual for a new programming language, you could join a community online. Of course, education, you might say it's a bit more than that. Well, I remember when I was actually training as a trainee computer programmer a long time ago, and we used to have days off for liberal arts. But now, of course, do you need to take days off where you sit in a room and you're taught about liberal arts? Or can you not join various communities and groups online and discuss these things? So on the other hand, I don't think places like Cambridge will ever be redundant. I think you can combine the two things. You can combine the opportunity to have a place which is dedicated towards higher education learning for the social networks, for the social possibilities. And I think that physical contact that we're missing now is really important. I'm personally really missing being able to go to conferences, not because of all the boring speeches, but because of the really interesting relationships that you build up. But at the same time, if we can bring in more of this global technology, these communities of learning that can be supported by the internet, and by AI techniques, which we could talk about, we could create a more flexible learning that was something like the best of both, instead of completely throwing away the past. But I'm still not sure you need a university degree to do computer programming. I'm not at all sure about that.
I mean, I was certainly wondering about that kind of serendipity aspect, and obviously the social and the networking. I was also, this is probably a very poor analogy, but, you know, I was also wondering about, you know, the difference between kind of radio and podcasting. You know, podcasting is sort of it's a narrow medium in the sense that you can just pursue the interest you're looking for. Whereas you turn on the radio, you get this kind of discovery process. And are there not, you know, many multidisciplinary fields in universities that sort of necessitate people to kind of come together and work with each other and create new things because of that won't go away?
You mean the serendipitous thing where you're forced to encounter people you wouldn't have encountered otherwise? And
yes, I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, so that might be a good use of a university, but that does make me think, I mean, these are things which we need to explore, because there really are new possibilities now, and we can't be sure they're going to work, so we ought to try them out. But one thing I would be interested in is switching it around from preparing people for future possibilities where they might need all that knowledge that you're teaching them, to taking it the other way around, to have for instance, a challenge-based education from quite an early age, where people are encouraged to work together in teams to solve real-world problems. And they might be local problems, or they might be any kind of problem. But inevitably, a real-world problem does involve interdisciplinarity, because they're usually rather complex. I mean, they're never just technical, they're also social, they also involve history. And if we restructured education like that, we might be encouraging young people and students to be interested in actually making a difference rather than just having a credential, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. What did you make of, you know, Ken Robinson, passed away recently, you know, had this very powerful argument that actually, as you get older, you tend to, you know, your brain sort of stiffens up, and actually, you know, young people are endlessly curious, and they don't have a kind of mental model and framework that gets in the way of things. And, you know, again, if you look at some technology areas, you know, software developers are often, you know, you hear of these prodigiously brilliant people who, you know, way younger than university age. I mean, is there something that we're educating ourselves out of, that actually this disruption could take, you know, encourage us to rethink as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. Although the first one, I don't think he said it's necessary to get all sclerotic and closed down as you get older. It just seems to happen. But I'm pretty sure there's good brain research that says it doesn't need to happen if you make an effort. I noticed that Roger Penrose, who got the Nobel Prize, I think yesterday, was also coming up with radical new theories about what was there before the Big Bang and what was there. And he must be quite old now. So we can keep fresh. But it is true that children are amazingly curious and active. I remember, I myself, I was fascinated by electronics, and I think I was really good at it, but it was kind of drummed out of me at school because it wasn't relevant, wasn't on the curriculum. So couldn't we encourage children to pursue their passions from an early age? And this is, you see this in animals as well. They start off curious, they start off keen to learn, they start off exploring everything. Now with humans, I think you can continue because it's a cultural thing, and you could encourage and support it. And one way you can do that with a more internet-based education is by enabling people to join communities about their specialism. So you could have a much more personalized education path instead of forcing them to make the limited number of choices that happen to be available in the school that you can go to around the corner with the teachers that you've got, which certainly happened to me.
Yeah, makes complete sense. I lived in India for 3 years, and I sort of got into yoga while I was there. And I remember saying to the teacher, you know, how do I get more flexible? And he said to me very sternly, he said, you know, you start off flexible. It's something you lose. It's not something that you gain. And I always made me think,
That's true. Yeah, I really think it's true with creativity. I really think it's horrifying, really, how we have all these people. How can we teach children to be creative? Well, they start off creative. They start asking all these questions, and let's face it, they are kind of told to shut up and listen and just do what they're told, aren't they? I mean, maybe there's obviously a useful role for that, but I think we should explore what happens if we don't do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's, I'm conscious of time, and that's obviously getting onto the area of what research contribution is required in this area. I mean, clearly there's lots of things that we could do with the educational system, but how will we know on a decent evidence-based basis of which options are good, which are less good? I mean, what work is needed here?
Well, I mean, I'm very pleased that ARM Education are supporting me and colleagues, including Genevieve, who's here at Cambridge, in developing a digital education futures institute in order to explore new models of education, because too much research in this area is basically evaluating whether things fit into the old system. Does it improve learning according to a standardized SATs test? Well, I think we want to explore, can we transform learning? Can we have a different model of learning? Can we assess real world outcomes in a rigorous way so that we can work as a kind of design workshop basis, really? We call it design-based research, with stakeholders, with practitioners, with policymakers, as well as with academics, to explore the impact and implications of new ways of doing education, not only to produce abstract research articles, but to serve as a catalyst for change, because policymakers want that kind of evidence. They need that kind of research. So we hope, working together with big companies like ARM and Epic Games are also supporting us, thanks very much. And we can develop that kind of research basis to create an education that's fit for the future and not merely being dragged back by all this legacy stuff.
Hallelujah to that. That sounds great. So I think probably I should invite Robert back in again. I don't know if there are any comments on the chat, but I know you'd want to say something about ARM Education and our offer here as well.
Yeah, so there haven't been any additional comments. So I mean, I've found the conversation fascinating. Especially, I was reading in today's paper that Dyson have actually started to issue degrees in engineering, which recognize. So there is a shift, I think, in terms of the way people are being educated in the higher education space. So it's a shame we don't have more time to kind of focus on that. But just quickly, yes. So ARM Education have a range of teaching and learning materials that people can take advantage of. We have education kits that are aimed at teaching staff at universities. We have textbooks, and we also have online courses, and we just launched an Embedded Systems Essentials course on edX. So I'm not saying that we're disrupting the educational space, but I think we're hoping to be part of the ecosystem. So there's lots more in the pipeline as well, and if people are interested, they can go to arm.com/education to take a look at all our content.
That's great. Thanks so much, Robert. And I was just seeing in the chat here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Sorry. I was just seeing in the chat somebody saying that they left school at 18, designing maths processes and communication protocols, and then back at school at 27, graduated at 31, 5 decades in the field. So, taught an online student. So, I think that's a really good story, and it'd be really encouraging if there were more kind of an interesting pathways, for technologists, for engineers. And I've really enjoyed speaking to you today, Rupert. Thanks again for your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks, Richard. Really good, really great questions, really interesting topic. And I do hope people are in some way inspired to think about this and see if they can take it forward, and perhaps get in touch with us at Cambridge if they have any useful collaboration ideas.
Yeah, we definitely encourage that. I mean, this seems like, the crisis has, obviously many challenges for people, but at least accelerating, change in education will hopefully bring some positive outcomes for everybody around the world. So, yeah, the more that we can work in collaboration together, the better, I think. So thanks again for your time today.
Oh, thank you very much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks everyone for listening. Thank you.